pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Ralph Mathekga, an independent political analyst, well renowned for his thought-provoking analysis on South African politics. Welcome, Ralph. We are really honored to have you here today with us, especially in the run-up to the general elections. And I think, most people are calling this the most pivotal elections that we've seen since the dawn of democracy. And we know that in this context, we are still struggling with a challenging economic environment. And I think as South Africans, we know that we can't just take that big hammer approach and try and fix everything at the same time. So I'd be keen to open our discussion just by hearing, what do you think are some of the main economic challenges that we can address as South Africans in order to correct the economic and social ills?
Thank you so much, Sanisha. It's a great pleasure to be here, to be chatting to you about elections, about politics, about society. And we are going into these elections where it seems as if everything matters, and it appears as if everything matters. You spoke about the economic conditions, a sense of crisis in the country, performance of government. Some people have pointed to capacity challenges in government. And when you look at this election, it brings a lot of expectations. We expect the elections to resolve or answer a lot of questions that have been left outstanding in South Africa for a while. And there is also a great deal of expectations that South Africa is going to make this some kind of a leap. And again, there is nothing wrong with it. People are entitled to have expectations, like citizens and voters, about the elections. If it were up to me, I'll tell you, I'll postpone these elections. Why? Everything else matters. We got a sense that, I have a sense that I wish we could pause a little bit, attend to a lot of problems. Electricity, get the economy going, resolve these things and get to a point where maybe we are calm and we can have elections. But those are just my thinking. It will never happen that way. Some will say that's why elections are important, to calm and resolve these issues. And we are going into these elections with a wide sense of expectations. I don't know if elections are going to meet those expectations, or we will look for answers in the subsequent elections. It's fascinating to look at elections. You get elections that do not meet your expectations, just wait for another elections. They will come.
Now, I think it's quite important that you say that. I don't think that there are many South Africans that couldn't agree with you that there are economic challenges that seem to be a little bit more pertinent than resolving for the next political regime in South Africa. I think there are a lot of economic ills that need to be sorted out. And I think in that light, what's quite reflective of that is the low voter turnout we've seen over the last couple of elections. Particularly if you look at the youth. We've even seen quite a vast number of youth not even bothering to register to vote, to really exercise their democratic right and cast that ballot on the day. And in light of that voter turnout, do you think that this time will be any different? Will we see any shift in voter turnout, especially with regards to what we've seen globally? It seems to be, not really a South African phenomenon, but that disenfranchisement seems to be a bit of a global phenomenon playing out. And I heard quite an interesting argument that, given that the African National Congress or the ruling party faces this real chance of potentially slipping below 50% for the first time since 1994, that you might actually see voter turnout increasing, the mobilization of those urban voters. So your thoughts on that?
And voter turnout is very interesting because it depends on a lot of things. It depends on the rain. If you have election during the day that there is rain, there is a possibility that rain can suppress turnout. If it's too cold, it's winter, it just happened to be that day when it bites, it's another factor that you just don't know until that day. How is it going to affect turnout? But I think in South Africa, we already have a sense as to what can we expect. And the concern that have been raised is that we don't have a distinct youth vote. We've got a large proportion of the youth as part of our population. Like Africa, South Africa, the youth they form quite a larger part of the population. Some have said because of that we are losing the youth dividends. We are not gaining from them, getting them employed and so forth. But the trouble in our society, including unemployment, are also concentrated within the youth. So that's why there is this expectations that you really expect the youth to come out in their high numbers and go vote. But that's not what is going to happen. It has been spoken about in the past. It's never happened that way. Is it good? Is it bad? South Africa's voter turnout is generally high. Generally. I mean, in a normal functioning democracy where people are not forced to vote, where people are not compelled to go vote, you know, in certain countries, you get fined for not voting. But we don't have that here. So if you look at that, you look at our voter turnout, you could say it's still relatively high. I know there's been concern that if the voter turnout become quite suppressed or look suppressed in this coming election, there's going to be quite problems. I don't think we should be worried so much. A week ago, I was in a forum with the one of the chairperson of the IEC, Mr. Sai Mamabolo, mentioned very interesting in that meeting that the youth number was quite good there. Interestingly, women, highest number of people who registered to vote in these elections as well. And when you look at these groups, you want to be saying, you want to see a group coming and representing a distinct voice. But that is not the case. South Africa's youth does not vote as a distinct youth. And that's not a big deal. What that actually means is that it could be the case that the youth believe the system will deal with their concerns as a system. There is no need to have a peculiar or a particular program to deal with the youth. That's why the youth in South Africa does not actually distinguish itself as a distinct group. Look at other parties that are meant to court the youth. How are they? The EFF, one of the parties that went out to target the youth. But you look at the proportion that they're getting of young people, it's not significant. So actually, I can say South Africa does not have a distinct youth vote. There is nothing bad. It actually says maybe the youth believes the mainstream politics can address their concern. As long as I don't see the youth going out of the system, disrupting the system, but remaining and participating like everybody else within the mainstream, then the system is fine. There is no need to have that distinct youth vote in order for us to understand that the youth have got a concern. Maybe the broader policy will deal with that. And I think generally South Africa's youth are also within other political parties. And we're also a conservative society. Let's be honest. Who wants to be led by very young people sometimes? I'm not saying, but look at our society. We are a conservative society. The average age of a political leader in South Africa, the last time I measured it, it was 60, 61. So when you see younger leaders, it still remain an exception to see them. Maybe they will be coming over a period of time. But where we are, it's still okay. It doesn't mean it's a loss if we cannot mobilize the youth as a distinct group. Maybe what we can ask is, are our policies addressing everybody else's concern, including the youth, before the youth can go on the route of maybe disrupting the system. The concern is if the youth disrupt. Our youth are not disruptive. I'm not saying they are in a good position, but they've learned to function within political parties, and it's not bad.
I think it's an important consideration, to think whether the youth can find a home, a political home within the mainstream parties, especially at this juncture of our political landscape where we've just seen, a proliferation of political parties just mushrooming in the last while. So I think, the last number I may have spotted there, almost more than 350 political parties now registering with the Independent Electoral Commission to participate in the next general elections. And, I think what you say is a lot of these political leaders are effectively having defected from the mainstream political parties in the hope that they can try and woo back some of these disillusioned voters, maybe in the youth or maybe in other age cohorts. But I think, there are two ways of viewing that, and I'm quite interested to hear what your opinion is on it. So with this record number of parties, there is almost a good tilt you can put on that and say South Africa is experiencing a very vibrant democracy. Yeah. The negative side of that coin is to say, well, does the number of political parties mushrooming in this political landscape actually reflect voter discontent with this established political system?
That's a very difficult question and a very interesting question. I mean, how do we explain the emergence of new parties, older parties, established parties struggling to remain or to even consolidate? You look at the youth, you look at whether the youth, and I don't want to talk about the youth only, I want to talk about women, other identity groups as well that are capable of organizing themselves into political project. We are seeing these parties coming out. We don't see much of youthful parties. Again, there are a lot of parties that have come out now. You're speaking about over 350 parties. It gets worse. I've seen 1,000 parties in the DRC elections, for example. It get worse. And whenever I see a longer ballot, it's scary. People feel like, yeah, it actually means we have not matured. But I want to say that let's be kind to ourselves. Let's not be too hard on ourselves. When people believe they can form political parties, organize political project and gain representation, that's better. It's much better. It is up to them as they participate over a period of time to realize that maybe as a party, we are not achieving what we want. We need to merge with that other party, maybe coalesce and achieve something else. Let it be if that is the case. But I'm not averse to the idea of proliferation. They call it proliferation of smaller parties, the emergence of smaller parties. I don't think there is a problem. It actually means voters want that. I've seen it in the 2021 local government election where I said voters were throwing the votes all over the place. They were giving a new party votes as they were coming in. I mean, the 3%ers, some parties got that 3% without knowing what they stand for. But what does that mean? Does it mean our voters are not thinking about it? No, it means that voters are actually showing confidence in formal representation. But they don't find the existing political parties sufficiently or adequate representation of their concern. That's why they're going to give 3% to a party that has not done anything. But I really have much trust in those voters, because instead of walking away from electoral processes, competitive process, instead of saying we don't believe in parties altogether, they are saying that we believe in parties, but this one that exists, we don't think they fully capture what we stand for. We will give it a try and give it to other political parties and make sure they come in. Hence, you have this long ballot. And if you look at South Africa, a country of over 60 million, historical inequalities, differences, a very dynamic, multicultural society, I don't think there should be anything wrong in having a fewer political parties. At some point, as our democracy matures, some parties will fall off, because they realize that, but that which we stand for can be achieved there, can be achieved there. So I don't see the emergence of newer parties as a crisis, but I know it is an irritant to existing parties that want to build that sense of existing, a sense of dominance. I mean, if you are the DA, you are the ANC, you are a bigger party. Yes, of course, you will be suspicious of smaller parties, because they are chipping away the votes from you as a bigger party. They are pushing you into coalition, into some kind of a co-governance, and you don't want that. So that's what we have seen. But generally, all in all, the emergence of smaller parties is a reflection of the vibrancy of democracy. Of course, it gets worse when you have 2,000 parties, but we are not there, and I think we can just see how far it goes.
I think it's an interesting trend to see how mature the electorate is becoming in South Africa. As you say, they're willing to give a smaller party 3% without them actually having to lay any groundwork in terms of turning around the economic story, just to kind of get that narrative going again. And you mentioned the Democratic Alliance, or the DA, which is also quite interesting, because the DA was one of those parties that tried to work very hard since the last election to almost rebrand themselves so that they can capture a more wider array of the electorate, and again, getting into some of those demographic groupings that they weren't very prominent in before. Do you think they've been successful at rebranding themselves? Do you think we're going to see that coming out in terms of the voter level of support they get in this next election?
The DA, they've been having problem, a bit of stagnancy there. the margins. I mean, they haven't grown in the previous elections. The last time they grew maybe was 2016 or so. They have not grown significantly. And I think that they are concerned about that. There is the idea that they have reached a ceiling within their traditional constituents, and therefore they need to go to other constituency. There is a mentioning of getting the black vote, the black middle class vote, as we refer to that. And the DA is struggling. But we also need to understand South Africa's politics is very fluid. These parties themselves are displaced. I mean, we talk about them every day. We want to get a sense of where South Africa's politics is going by looking at these parties. But I can tell you that they themselves are displaced. They themselves are just out of their depth. They're trying to survive. I mean, things are very fluid here. You are trying to consolidate as the Democratic Alliance. You have got smaller parties coming out. Some of the prominent leaders leaving your party, taking away a small piece of your morality with them. Just that small piece, incrementally, you have to respond why black leaders are not being able to survive within. And then we're going back to the difficult race question within South Africa's politics. And unfortunately, there is nothing you can do. You have to open yourself to this debate as the Democratic Alliance. You cannot reduce the DA's challenge in growth to a single factor of the question of race and fitting. It's quite complex. A very fluid political system. The DA trying to grow outside the Western Cape in places such as Gauteng, where they depend on some of the local leaders here, ultimately finding it difficult to control those leaders at some point as they enter into agreement locally based on some of the local consideration. So it's a very difficult time now to be an established political party in South Africa. It's a very difficult time. They are displaced. They are trying to manage the political system that we are saying they dominate, and ultimately they're actually leading it from behind. They are not fully dominating it. They are struggling. And this is the age of a new party. What is the most exciting thing in South Africa? It is the unknown. It is a new party because we don't know it. How can we be so excited about the unknown? And we know that, unfortunately, that's just where we are, or I should not say unfortunately, maybe even fortunately. It is fascination with this politics of the unknown because the known political projects are not attractive enough. That's just the way it is now. Is it a crisis of democracy? Not necessarily. It's part of the evolution. It's part of the development of our democracy. And I think we should stay strong as the people and understand these are some of the challenges and irritations that come with democratic processes.
You know, speaking about, just carrying on this process and sticking it through, it comes to mind the third largest political party that we saw out of the 2019 elections, the Economic Freedom Fighters. Support them, don't support them. They've managed to do something that many of the other smaller players did not manage to achieve, and that was to become more than just a one-hit wonder.
Yeah.
And I think given the splintering of the electorate today, it is, a new question comes about that whether the EFF will actually manage to retain that momentum going forward, or will we actually see support being chipped away from them as well as we see with the other two mainstream parties?
The EFF is becoming an established party. You play into the election once, you go into the election twice, and again, they are playing into power in other cities. They are being part of government here and there, even at a restrained level. So how are they? How have they been? I mean, you cannot ignore them. Whether or not you agree with the EFF, the reality is that they have managed to shake South Africa's democracy. They went to parliament, and when they came in, they said people were sleeping there, literally, and then people started seeing what's happening in parliament. And they've done it by presenting themselves as this party that doesn't play at the center. You can say they're an outlier in a sense of they're a party that is far. They're not inside. They're not part of the establishment. They are in parliament, but they've got the right to go and take matters in their own hands and go disrupt a shop when there is an issue of social a social problem there. They play into formal politics, but they reserve their right to do what they want and address an issue the way in which they see it fit. So this is a party that has played it both ways, and they've been successful. The question is, where to from now? I mean, the challenge with populist policies, even if they are linked to the true issues on the ground, is that you actually reach diminishing return very quickly. How radical can you get? I mean, you push it and then you get 10%, and then at some point you realize it doesn't matter how extreme and how radical I'm getting, I'm no longer attaining support. There isn't much of reward, which comes down to South Africa's electorate, because the voters do speak. South Africa's voters do not excessively reward radicalism. They do not. I don't know, are they conservative voters? Maybe. I mean, you look at radical parties like the EFF. If you look at the level of inequality in South Africa, you look at the challenges that we have, the EFF should be sitting at 30%. But no, voters are saying, yes, we like hearing you, but we don't want to hear you every day, okay? We want to give you a certain percentage up to a certain point. We respect you to an extent that you remind, or you keep being a reminder that the democratic system has to be this way, but not to a point of saying we need to get rid of this system and have what is being proposed as part in the mainstream. Voters are very purposeful, and I have to say they are very smart. They don't vote by accident. If they give you 2% as a party, it's because they knew what they were doing, the voters. They wanted to give you that 2% to see what you can do with it. That's what they're doing with other parties. With parties that are radical, they've given them the vote that they've given them, and it is up to those parties to see whether do you become less radical to increase your vote, or where are the rewards when it comes to increasing your electoral share.
But Ralph, this is a bit of a reminder that, South Africa doesn't act in isolation. This is almost what is playing out in the US economy with Donald Trump. It's the shock factor. Yeah. And if he does, get a second term in politics, there will need to be an additional layer of shock factor for your electorate to continue to support you. I think in South Africa, the EFF has been that prominence behind the radical factor. And we wouldn't be able to have this discussion without speaking about former President Jacob Zuma's Mkhonto weSizwe party, or the MK party. Yeah. And I'm quite keen to hear whether you think that they are going to be the next destabilizing factor. Now, we spoke about some of the smaller parties being these one-hit wonders.
Yeah.
But there's something a little bit unique about the MK party in that they came with a political ideology. They came with, ideas in their manifesto, because it is almost seen to be a de facto break-off party, a faction of the ANC that already had that established groundwork for a political party. Do you think that's enough to get them into that political discourse to really shake things up a little further?
I think it's about political power, and people do not just form political parties because they felt good and they just woke up loving people. There should be realistic prospect of accessing power, and it is there through this. And accessing power is ultimately going to be influencing decisions on where resources are being directed. So the MK party, realizing the credibility crisis of the ANC, they emerged as a very attractive, almost, I don't want to say franchise of the ANC, because these parties sometimes, they take from their mother party, if you like, and they reconfigure their position. But the MK party, it is one of the main irritants to the ANC. First of all, they did not want to mince their words. They went straight to that moral from the history of the ANC, calling themselves an MK party. And guess what? They went to court and they were challenged. They won. They kept on winning and winning and winning on the name, on taking the ANC. And I mean, the MK is supposed to be, if you really want to build a different brand, really, you are genuine about doing something, why would you appropriate something that you know exactly belongs to another political party? The idea of MK. They did that. Why? It's because they are going into the same space. that the ANC is. They are going to challenge the ANC. They are going to chip away the ANC's electoral base. It is because it's doable. These parties are going to position themselves, first of all, low-hanging fruit, doable politics. Can you actually access power? What is the next step? Can you find yourself around the table when coalitions are being negotiated? Yes. Will the MK party find itself around the table when coalitions are negotiated for KZN government? Most likely, yes. Because of the way in which things have developed there. The ANC has always been weak in KZN. So this is one party that has come out that way to chip away on the existing party. Interesting is that in the subsequent election, there might be another party to do a better job than what the MK is doing. So you have more of these parties coming out. That is why they do not consolidate. They come through, get 4-5%. The lucky ones can just increase a little bit with a marginal increment. Usually we see a decline, leadership problems. Already the MK party has already fired people even before they could go to the polls. They're already having a leadership crisis. Again, that's the culture of political parties in South Africa. They all have leadership problems at different degrees because it reflects on just the political culture that we have.
Ralph, you introduced the C word, coalitions. Yeah. And I know this is an unfair question to ask as we head into elections, because as we head into elections, it's always known as the silly season. Yeah. And, votes can change on a whim. But I think our viewers will be quite interested, and I'm also quite interested, just to hear your thoughts on how we're going to see the vote split coming out of the general elections. The C word, the coalition word, we might see this on a provincial level, but there's also a chance, if we look at the polls, that we might actually see this playing out on a national level. And I think, South Africa has a bit of a reputation for not having such good coalitions at a local government level in some areas. Given that since 2016, a number of hung councils, we saw a lot of displacement occurring there with political parties. But in that same breath, of the top performing coalitions, I think the last number I saw, there were at least 4 that were in fact governed by coalition governments, which tells us that there might actually be a space in the current political discourse for coalitions to have a more successful way of improving the economic and social outcomes for SA. So quite key to hear what you think is going to really evolve out of these election results, and what happens with the coalition side of things.
I'm quite positive about coalitions. And I think for me, it's a question of whether you're going to have weaker coalition or stronger coalitions. And even weaker coalitions are still good for democracy, by the way. I mean, coalition entail co-governance, something that is lacking in South Africa's political culture. South African parties have got this sense of majoritarianism, whereby parties always believe that if you deposit political power in a single place in a party, it will most likely be exercised effectively. We have seen how this thing went about. The ANC was unchallenged for quite a while, and we have had a problem of accountability, oversight issue there, Parliament, where we ended up with state capture inquiry, which is the widest inquiry to ask who has been doing something wrong, very wide inquiry. So if you look at that, shift to coalition will actually mean more people have to discuss for one thing to be decided. There will be delay in decision making, but we'll get used to it. We're going to learn to function within that. Suddenly you have 5 parties to talk to, parties, interest groups, and so forth to talk to before you pass a policy. When you go through various iterations, various parties, interested parties, stakeholders, the policy changes and shifts. That's what policies do. If you come and discuss a policy with me, when you leave slightly altered, you go to someone else slightly altered. At the end of the day, you have a policy that reflects, not necessarily to be saying directly the views of the people, but somewhere, somehow, there is more consultation on policy than it has been the case before. That's what we have been lacking. We need that in the coalitions. So coalitions are going to be good. We don't need grand coalitions to function. People tend to think for coalitions to work, you need this amazing group of people that are so focused. You're going to lock them in a dark room and they will agree on point A to Z. No, it doesn't work that way. You can find what I call pay-as-you-go coalition. You fill up the airtime on an issue, You want to decide on economic policy. You have got a governing coalition at another level, but now when it comes to various policy projects, you shop around for policy. You know, if you are in a coalition, I'll give an example. If the ANC and the EFF are in coalition, and then the ANC want to push a policy that the EFF does not like, but they're already in a coalition, what that will mean is that the EFF will find it incumbent upon themselves not to attack the ANC on that policy. What they will then do as the EFF will be to say to the ANC, go look for someone to help you pass that, but we are not attacking you. Isn't that how things function? Next time is the EFF wanting concession. The ANC say, we don't want to support that, but we are not going to attack it. So go find support. That's what I say, pay as you go. You go find a minister who can support this, and it becomes co-governance. And at the end, you have got decisions that reflect the society more than the decisions that go through one place because of the belief that the truth is found in one place. That's fallacy.
Ralph, I think, it's quite difficult to always, get beyond the short term, especially when the risks in the political calendar are as high as they are today. But I also want to get your views on sort of the long-term political cycles and how these evolve in South Africa. I look at the ANC being the single party that's very dominant in South Africa. And I look at, a more formalized and mature democracy like the US or the UK, where you've got a two-party state effectively. So in the US, you've got the Democrats and Republicans. And over in the UK, you've got the Labour and the Conservative parties. Does South Africa, with our 350 political parties, ever get to that point where we can be a two-party state?
It's not necessary. I mean, two-party state, the belief is that, when we studied political science, we were told far back that it's the symbol of maturity, but it's the US system matured as it is. We have seen the insurrection, Donald Trump and so forth. One of the biggest concerns that some people have in the US will be that the mainstream as they represent us is too far from the people. And the mainstream is that two-party. So it does not always have to end at a two-party state. We can have permanent coalitions. It's okay. It's not bad at all. The question is learning to function within that institutional framework of co-governance. South Africa has got strong institutions. You need civil society. You don't always need strong political parties to drive political projects in society. No. You need political parties that function within civil society, voters that are well informed, more options there. If groups feel they need to be represented in the system, we have not even entered identity politics. I can even challenge your viewers to say, if they think that we have got fewer parties, they haven't even gone for. We don't even have the LGBTQ party. You see, we haven't started. We don't have a rural party. We don't have this and that party. We still have a long way to go before maybe we coalesce into that two-party. But by the look of things, I think the cookie frame of two-party is not going to work for us.
So taking this 40,000 feet long-term political view, I would argue that since 2008, we have operated in a very different economic regime, much higher levels of volatility. We've seen, GDP and things like inflation, interest rates really oscillate in quite a big manner over the last couple of years. It's also operated against a backdrop of much higher geopolitical risk, higher political risk in general. And it's also been accompanied by this element of stepping away from globalization. But even though we have less globalization than what we did before, less of a drive for it, we are also seeing more political groupings, more economic groupings. So if you think about the Global South movement or the BRICS alliance expanding, can South Africa ever get a louder voice on the political stage to really represent the African continent and maybe even more, to talk about things like global climate change or security threats? What do we need to do to get there, or are we already there?
Very simple. Get your story right back home first. I mean, even in old classical days, if you go read about foreign affairs, you can't do good foreign affairs if you can't do good home affairs, to start with. And I'm not saying you need a single party that is going to define the local project and therefore you can have better foreign affairs. All I'm saying is that you need stronger, more parties. You need to strengthen your local project. You need to be able to build a state that has got capacity locally. And then from then, you can then go on foreign affairs. It becomes very difficult for countries to pronounce themselves beyond their borders if they cannot get it so well. Who's going to take you seriously, by the way? If you go out, you take to the international podium, and then you pronounce even on those international issues, but back home, you are not getting it right. So if you get it right, it will align very well. But we have seen recently some of the countries not getting it right at home and deliberately trying to obfuscate that, eclipse that by undertaking some foreign diplomatic ventures and misadventures that you look at them and you see that this is an admission that I just can't get it well back home. That's why I'm doing this.
Ralph, it's been amazing to have you on, and your input has been so insightful. I'm sure our viewers have gained quite a lot from it. I just wanted to tie it back and hand it over to you. At the beginning, you said, it's quite important to not look at this election as a make it or break it. Yeah. We have been through pivotal elections before. Yeah. And in that, I think, our clients are sometimes a little bit nervous when we go into something that has a lot of event risk. Yeah. And we often tell our clients that we do diversify the portfolios so that we don't always, have all our eggs in one basket for one particular economic or political outcome. Is there anything that you'd finally like to share with the viewers in terms of how to actually view going into these elections, the type of risk that is associated with it, and maybe just to leave them with a sense of comfort?
Yeah, I have observed South Africa for years, and I can assure you, this is not a country that wakes up with radical moves. South Africa is a country of gradualists. Yes, they talk radical the whole day, no doubt about it, but it's not a country of people who make unpredictable radical moves. So whatever these elections are likely to bring, it's already setting in. And what is it that is being setting in? Parties need to talk to each other to pass policy. The NC has been trying to talk to others as well around expropriation and so forth. So we are entering that stage of co-governance. And it's not tragic. I really think a better country will come out of this as our political system is evolving. And I'm very positive, but I'm realistically positive as well.
Thank you so much, Ralph. I really look forward to chatting to you again soon. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.